Wonderful. Okay. Hello, everybody. We are waiting for folks to come in, take their virtual seat. It is noon in New York City, so maybe you have your lunch at your desk and are taking a little break while you are watching Co-opting AI. Get comfortable. We have a terrific event planned for you today, and we're very happy and grateful that you are here today. At this point, I usually say, well, if we were in the real space of the Institute of Public Knowledge, we would probably now grazing the buffet and checking in with friends. And I'm very happy to report that we are hopefully coming back to that very soon with in-person events at the Institute for Public Knowledge. And with that, I want to welcome you all and formally open Co-opting AI Queer. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing this space with us. Now, before we start the event, I would like to express my deep hope that the atrocious war against Ukraine will end soon and that justice will prevail. I commend the Ukrainian people for their strength and solidarity, and I hope that we will be able to rebuild and repair the country of Ukraine swiftly and collectively. My name is Dr. Mona Sloan. I use she, her pronouns. I am a sociologist at New York University, where I study the intersection of society and technology. I am a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge, a senior research scientist at NYU Center for Responsible AI, and I'm also an adjunct professor at the Tandon School of Engineering, and I convene the Co-opting AI series. I am a white woman with short, dark hair and acrylic glasses, blue earrings, and a burgundy jacket over a black t-shirt. Now, this event today will examine how artificial intelligence systems that rely on data extraction and automated large-scale data classification and processing can solidify heteronormative and ableist socio-technical infrastructures. Our conversation will draw on connections between queer studies and activism, disability studies, and critical technology studies to consider how queering AI can serve both as a critique and as a creative practice that interrogates and challenges discrimination in technology. I'm very happy to say that we have a wonderful ASL interpreter with us today called Eliza. Welcome. And on CART captioning, we have Maggie. Thank you for being here. Co-opting AI would not be possible without the generous support and sponsorship of the Institute for Public Knowledge, the 370J Project, and the Department of Technology, Culture, and Society at Tandon. Thank you for your continuous and generous support of this series. Now, very importantly, this event today is the inaugural event of the new Disability and the Digital series, which is a new series of conversations hosted between scholars from the US, Germany, and Turkey, namely Hannah Goebel, Robert Stock, Melike Shainul, Mara Mills, and myself. There are many more events to follow after this one. And this series brings together perspectives from North America, Europe, and the Middle East, and will convene conversations on embodiment, bodily belongings, disability, and the digital at the intersection of sociology, cultural studies, disability studies, and activism. The point of departure for this new series is to strengthen the international dialogue along the most recent developments in that space. And the aim is to generate conversations and impulses for a sustainable international community that explores the role of digital technologies in the heterogenization, my apologies, of society. As we kick off, I want to acknowledge that I'm standing on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples, and I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community and to commit to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. I also want to express my commitment to the ongoing project of tackling white privilege and systemic racism, and to develop an anti-racist culture in our communities and institutions, and the academy in particular. Now, I'm very excited to introduce to you my co-moderator for today's Co-opting AI event, who will lead or co-lead today's conversation, Arjun Subramanian. Arjun is a brown queer neurodivergent PhD student and Cota Robles Fellow at the University of California in Los Angeles. Their research focuses on inclusive graph machine learning and natural language processing, drawing from mathematical theory and LGBTQIA+ perspectives. They are a core organizer of Queer in AI, a NeurIPS 2022 Affinity Workshops Chair, and a NAACL 2022 DEI Chair. They previously organized queer hacks and taught machine learning and AI ethics at under-resourced schools in Los Angeles. Arjun graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science from UCLA, where they received the School of Engineering's Outstanding Bachelor of Science, Chancellor Service, and Student Welfare Awards. Arjun is also on Twitter at Arjun Subgraph. Arjun, thank you so much. Welcome, and over to you for introducing the topic and then the panelists. Thank you.
Mona, thank you so much. So as Mona mentioned, my name is Arjun. I use they, them pronouns. Just a little visual description. I'm a brown individual with black hair. I'm currently wearing glasses and an orange shirt. So I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to some of the topics that might be discussed today. And I want to acknowledge that some of the content that I'm going to say is taken from a draft of a Queer in AI paper that is yet to be released. So the design, development, and deployment of AI-driven technologies have long harmed and excluded queer people. As a result, these technologies encode and reinforce cisnormativity and heteronormativity, misgendering and outing end users, just to name a few examples. At the same time, the LGBTQIA+ community has leveraged AI-driven technologies to connect and realize more authentic ways of being. For instance, online spaces have been important for queer people, especially youth, to build community, experiment with new identities, and learn about queerness. But since online spaces are usually not designed by, with, or for queer people, they frequently harm, marginalize, and or underserve queer communities. Pervasive and insidious data collection and AI-based surveillance threatens outing. For example, Egyptian police officers have utilized Grindr to pinpoint the location of people suspected of being LGBTQIA+. Furthermore, queer people are more likely to experience online harassment, yet they do not benefit from automated content moderation and are victims of the widespread automated censorship of queer language and identities. For example, Salty Algorithmic Bias Research Collective found substantial evidence of censorship on Instagram for people who are transgender and or non-binary, LGBTQIA, BIPOC, disabled, sex workers, and or sex educators. These issues are only compounded for disabled queer individuals who are regarded as passive recipients and not as the creators of technology. Online spaces, which lack color contrast and screen reader support, fail to meet even basic accessibility standards, thereby inhibiting many queer disabled people from accessing critical online communities. Beyond online spaces, AI has been used to give a dangerous veneer of legitimacy to physiognomy and phrenology, including using computer vision to identify and out queer people, infer binary gender from faces, and automate the diagnosis of neurodivergence. All these technologies are premised on medical models of queerness and disability, relying on biomedical standards of normal bodies and classifying what falls outside of these standards as pathological. Language models are trained on data sets containing hate speech and censored of queer words and overwhelmingly fail to account for non-binary genders and diverse pronouns, contributing to the erasure of these identities. Furthermore, the use of language models in assistive technologies like communication access, real-time translation systems harms queer disabled folks, as our very own Louise Hickman points out. Underlying the use of language models in captioning systems is the erroneous assumption that transferring speech and visual data into readable and spoken text is a neutral process. Queer in AI has observed that the usage of automated transcription has resulted in the butchering of queer language and misgendering of speakers. Boker and Starr and Keyes argue that hegemonic forms of AI are fundamentally focused on classifying complex people and situations into narrow categories and scaling at the cost of context. Furthermore, they are applied to reinforce surveillance, prediction, and control. Hence, this conceptualization of AI is incompatible with queerness and disability. Consequently, theorizing models of AI that are inclusive of and celebrate queerness and disabilities becomes a critical step towards preventing active harm to and even benefiting the LGBTQIA+ and disabled communities. Sarah Morais dos Santos Bruce has argued for the interrogation of notions of disembodied AI and critical work on more inclusive AI representation. We might then ask, what does it mean to queer AI? How can the integration of disabled epistemologies lead to the creation of AI systems that don't assume disabled people need to be fixed? How may we harness the knowledge of queer disabled folks who resist disabling intersecting vectors of categorization as abnormal to imagine a better AI future? And how do we contextualize this future in other structures of oppression, example on the basis of race and gender and across cultures?
Thank you so much for this elaborate and very important introduction, Arjun. And I cannot think of a better panel to delve into these questions today. So with that, I want to welcome to the virtual stage Dr. Louise Hickman and Dr. Sarah Morais dos Santos Bruce. Starting us off will be Dr. Hickman, who is an activist and scholar of communication and uses ethnographic, archival, and theoretical approaches to consider how access is produced for disabled people. Her current project focuses particularly on access produced by real-time stenographers and transcriptive technologies in educational settings. She uses an interdisciplinary lens, drawing on feminist theory, critical disability studies, and science and technology studies to consider the historical conditions of access work and the ways access is co-produced through human and primarily female labor, technological systems, and economic models and conditions. Dr. Hickman is currently a research associate at the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy at the University of Cambridge in the UK, and previously worked as a senior research officer at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the media department. She also worked at the Ada Lovelace Institute's Just AI Network on data and AI ethics and continues to convene the Just AI's working group on rights, access, and refusal. An academic, artist, activist, she earned her PhD in communication from the University of California at San Diego in 2018 and held a postdoctoral position in the Feminist Labor Lab at UC San Diego. Since 2016, Dr. Hickman has also worked as an access consultant and speaker for Parkeology, which is a US-based public art program. Following Dr. Hickman will be Dr. Sarah Moraes dos Santos Bruce, who is a cultural and media theorist, feminist, and educator currently affiliated with the Gender Concept Group at the Technical University Dresden's Digital Gender Project as a postdoc. Dr. Moraes dos Santos Bruce's current research explores dimensions of technological relationality, materiality, and aesthetics. More specifically, she interrogates AI imaginaries and their material realities through feminist, queer, and decolonial theorizing, currently focusing on speculative AI projects and the arts. She's on the board of Diffract Center for Theoretical Periphery in Berlin, and editor at kritischlesen.de, and affiliated researcher with the Data Politics Lab, a collective committed to exploring political dimensions of technological governance. A heartfelt welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for being here. One word before I hand over to Dr. Hickman. Dear audience, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will be collecting those and we will be turning to those in the Q&A part towards the end of our conversation. And with that, I'm going to be quiet and with joy hand over to our two panelists, Dr. Hickman, Dr. Moraes Santos. Welcome, Arjun. Thank you so much. And with that, the stage is yours, Dr. Hickman.
Thank you for that kind introduction. It's really great to be here. I want to thank everyone at the Co-opting AI for inviting us and putting together this panel today, and looking forward to the other panel on disability and digital, if I got the name right. So visual description, I am a white female with glasses on, and I always describe my headphones being slightly off-centered to fit my hearing aids. I have clashing patterns. I'm wearing clashing pattern today, and I have a rather busy background, which I think is going to take too long to describe, because believe me to say it's busy. So today, I would like to give a short provocation on the title, The Queering the Wicked Problem of Work, which this general kind of provocation comes under the new kind of project that well, it's not new, it's an ongoing project of mine, a book project called, under the broad title of Crip AI, which I'm going to switch between queer theory and Crip theory today to kind of draw out some of the nuances that we can hopefully inform our discussion later on. So, wicked problem. Over the past year, since the pandemic started, I have at various places given talks on my project, which very loosely, very kind of quickly, I summarize. I mostly talk about the intimate forms of labor that's required to do captioning work, which means building job dictionaries, which as we might recognize today, we have Maggie here who is captioning for us. So essentially I look at how captioners do real-time work. So there's a real kind of on-demand labor. So in a sense, thinking about wicked problems, most Q&A of these talks have always directed me toward wicked problems. And so I thought today that I would use that as a way to kind of start at the end, if you like, and maybe we can talk about later on is like the kind of values of wicked problem or how we can turn them on their head. For those who are less familiar with wicked problem, it was coined by two design scholars in the early 70s. Let me see if I got this right. Horst Rittel and Marvin Weber. The kind of loose definition, there are many definitions of wicked problems. They share purporeous boundaries, they lack a central logic, and there is an absence of a stoppage valve. These are all attributes of design thinking, which is useful for today's discussion in the sense that it involves multiple stakeholders. So when we talk about building community or community capacity building, we're talking about drawing from a diverse range of backgrounds and how we can center those backgrounds around a common theme. So I'm going to bracket off wicked problem for a moment, and I'm going to turn quickly to crip theory. I draw on, and as we have gone over in the introductions, I draw on critical disability studies, media studies and communication to really think about how we can think about work and productivity on platform-based economies, right, through those kind of lens. Pulled together, when we're thinking about all these terms and background and disciplinary background, I'm particularly interested in how we think about the political economy of access work. So this could be paid, unpaid, and also like how access work. And when I talk about access work, I'm referring to the proliferation of access workers. So we might consider an ASL interpreter, a captioner. We might look at a Uber driver as an access worker. The relationships of these positions are increasingly precarious, and maybe this is something we can talk about. So why access work? Why access workers? I think it's useful to think about how certain work is devalued and how those work, through being devalued, are caught up in a politics of austerity, which is very prevalent in the UK right now, or has been for the last 10 years, a slow dismantling of the welfare state. So this, I think, if those who are familiar with crip theory, is a kind of link, kind of homage to crip austerity and compulsory able-bodiedness. And so here I'm really, in this conversation today, I'm really bringing together a link between on-demand labor and compulsory able-bodiedness. So this relies on the work of crip studies theorists, Robert McGruer, Alison Tafer, and even though crip theory was, well, I think it was published 15 years ago now, was really revolutionary at the time. We're really thinking about how compulsory able-bodiedness in this particular work produces disability, and the same goes for compulsory heterosexuality produces queerness. So this looks at the system and how the system becomes interwoven. So we can see both of the attributes as a kind of agent of capitalism, which I think is useful if we're starting to unpack the kind of logic behind wicked problems and design thinking. I put in my notes here, like, can we coin the term compulsory productivity? Have other people coined this term? Does this short circuit the human and the idea of the worker within the system that is producing access? So just to give you a sense, at the beginning of the pandemic, when we kind of moved all our classes online and there was events online, this shift created a huge demand for captioning services online, and which is great that there was this uptake. But actually what happened was this uptake actually meant that there was a lot of deaf people and disabled people who couldn't actually access the service they normally use because there was a demand placed on this service because of these new conditions. And so which leads to this kind of issue where there was deaf people relying on automated captions. So it's a creation of a two-tier system. So we can maybe look at that and then we can see how this is lending the kind of framework of the wicked problem. So why wicked problem? I don't know, I kind of really wanted to use this in a playful way today to kind of honor like the queer AI, you know, and but also really bring into the picture how perhaps design thinking itself is becoming more entrepreneurial. And with that, you know, you see access work increasingly being outsourced to cheaper alternatives. They don't often, that doesn't, often this means it's not reliable, it's not within the remit of what we see when we use apps and so forth. And so in this vein, like thinking about design thinking is like, how can we find moments to refuse access work, which seems kind of contradictory? And how can we advocate for fair working conditions for access workers? Again, these are really, well, I know, I feel like I'm falling into the trap of the wicked problem again, but you can see how we're kind of continually going around. So just to kind of close out, because I really want to have this proposition out in discussion, we can sum this up by really thinking about the wicked problem and the demand of productivity. And then we can also think about the role of refusal and how we can build on a range of perspectives. And I don't want to say drawing on counter publics. Actually, I want to perhaps think about how do we make wicked publics? Instead of thinking wicked problems, how can we center our discussion, or part of our discussion today, around thinking about what is a wicked public instead of a counter public? And I will now end on that note. I have other things that I can add in the discussion and Q&A. And now I am going to hand over to Sarah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Louise, for this exciting provocation. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Yeah, hi, my name is Sarah, and I also want to thank Mona for putting together this lovely event. And I'm very, very honored to be able to speak in this series and to contribute to this series with so many wonderful thinkers who have gone ahead of me. And I also want to thank Arjun for their provocation, which very well framed a lot of the things that I will actually also be talking about. And I will kind of go into more detail with him in a bit. And I think, Arjun, that you've allowed me to cut short some of the bits of my presentation, which is really great, though, because that means that we can enter into the discussion more quickly. Let me share my screen. I've prepared a small presentation. Before I do, I did want to also shortly describe myself as a speaker. I am an able-bodied individual with light skin privilege. I have brown hair and I am wearing a burgundy jacket. So My work, as Mona already mentioned, looks at aesthetics as a site that produces a tension between representation and identification. And I want to talk about how the logics of AI have translated visibility into targeting and into the very same kind of problematics that Louise has already described about how sexualities, certain marginalized sexualities, are being targeted as something that is in some way vulnerable and needs protection. And I want to do so with something that I'm sure you've all heard about. So I want to begin with the so-called gaydar study by Wang and Kuczynski. This is a study that in 2017, and it was actually repeated in 2019, it set out to prove that, and this is the quote, the title of the study, "Deep neural networks are more accurate than humans at detecting sexual orientation from facial images." So these studies did a lot of the things that Arjun described. They had scraped public data off of dating sites, accessing facial data without asking for permission, but also potentially outing people who were not officially out beyond these dating sites. The algorithm relied on a biased data set that predominantly included white male faces because white males are the ones most likely to show face in queer dating apps. And the study thus relied on a very common unbalance, which was first pointed out by Joy Bulamwini, that women, non-binary, trans, and Black and brown people were less visible to the algorithm. So the algorithm read cultural traits such as dress codes and styles, tweezed eyebrows, facial hair, and even wearing a base cap as expressions of interiority, relying on eugenesis principles of correlation and actually applying them to lifestyle choices. And this kind of led to sexual preferences being read as a rigid expression and an unchanging modality of being that translates into a material biogenetic form. So contrary to feminist and queer theorizing that has discussed how sexuality and gender are dynamic and are changeable over time, the algorithm was supposedly uncovering some truth of queerness by revealing its material form. And I think despite the many critiques, what remained was kind of this understanding that for better or for worse, sexuality had become somewhat computable. So there was an authentic expression that was identifiable and thus either protectable or vulnerable to attack. And this argument has, of course, delegated harm back to the bodies. So instead of saying people should stop harassing and killing queer and trans people, the sentiment is these queer people are particularly vulnerable, and that's why we have to identify them, because somehow the harm emerges from their bodies. And it's already been mentioned that this has found their way into algorithmic governance. So TikTok and other platforms have taken to shadow banning, a practice that restricts the visibility of posts flagged as potentially promoting explicit content. And it is a practice that vastly affects queer and off-color communities and creators, as well as body positivity, crypt and trans pedagogical content. So TikTok at the time was arguing that they were limiting vulnerability to protect these bodies from harassment. But as Arjun has also already mentioned, the algorithmic bias reports by Salty Mag has shown that this not only happens in terms of shadow banning, but that content is also actually removed more often for LGBTQI plus communities, trans non-binary communities, and CRIP and disabled people's work. Now, the wonderful Nishant Shah has introduced me to CANT videos, which are amateur videos that show mostly Indian men engaging in, as the translation would have it, a little bit of fun. This fun consists of all sorts of dressed and undressed activities. In the videos, people caress each other, touch and kiss, and pretend to or actually do have sex in different settings. Now, these videos of presumably straight men, as Nishant discusses in his book, Really Fake, were used for pornographic consumption by queer folks, but also refused to be read as such by the addition of the hashtag no homo. And I was really curious about this. And so I started following the hashtag across platforms, and I have noticed that it very often accompanies ambivalent representations of queer desire. So this not only suggests that queer desire has seeped into heteronormative and even homophobic communities, which then refuse to give it recognition, but also that it's not only about identifying what may or may not be considered gay or queer today. So there is kind of this usage of and attempt to distance oneself from notions of queerness, which remind me that in a heteronormative and queerphobic society, queerness is potentially always about hiding in plain sight. So instead of giving in to becoming legible by the algorithm, I want to suggest that the hashtag #NoHomo can be read as an attempt of disidentification, which Jose Esteban Munoz describes as a campy over-the-top performance that transforms the object that homophobic society pathologizes. So there's this hope of transformation, which also reminds us that queer was once a slur. So in the face of algorithmic harms that function through identification and intelligibility, I wonder, could the hashtag #NoHomo be an act of refusal? Jack Halberstam has been one of the most recent voices to remind us that queer signals towards an evasion of categorization rather than a claim of authenticity, originality, or truthiness. So queer is a way of doing things, an affective sensation, and an articulation of refusal. And what I want to suggest is that the notion of co-opting around which this event series has organized itself is a central strategy of retaining community within regimes regulated by algorithmic harms and platforms that extend beyond the technological. The hashtag #NoHomo then carries the potential to refuse not only the politics of identification and categorization that delegate queer desire to the shadows, but the politics of identification that are continuously working to define, and thus I would argue confine, queerness in a form that can be governed and targeted. And I want to mention at least one of several examples that I think are kind of working with this notion of trying to re-embody data and AI without actually working with politics of identification in that sense. So the collective Melt, it's an artist design duo that works with queer, crypt, and trans pedagogics to think through what it would mean to produce data that is not used to rigidify social understandings of each other. And I had the privilege of recently being able to host one of their workshops, and Melt produced this speculative workshop that was based on the question, how can we experiment towards and uphold AI, understood here as ancestral intelligences, autistic ingenuity, airy inquiries, and artificial intelligence? How can we understand these systems and formats as something that does not continue to reproduce the varied violence currently levied against trans, queer, and disabled people? In their workshop, Melt invited people into a role-play mission that reformulated data and drew upon queer histories of alliances, beginning with Marsha P. Johnson. Melt experiments with different modalities of encountering and understanding AI, data, and so on, and does so beginning with trans and queer experience. And their interests lie in alternative and sensorial modalities of knowledge production, so in storytellings, in affective encounters, and in aesthetics and performance elements, which enable them to rethink what we might understand as a technology and engage in queer historicizing and critical fabulation that does not rely on identification, but on community. And perhaps I'll end here because I think my time is already up, and I'm really happy to see what the conversation will bring. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much to both Louise and Sarah for your really thought-provoking presentations. I will hand it to Arjun for the first question, and Arjun will also steer us through the panel discussion part. And dear audience, now's the time to start putting questions into the Q&A chat, which we will promise to pick up.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you for those wonderful provocations. I learned so much, and I'm just so excited to be here and be able to hear all this amazing stuff. So I guess I kind of wanted to start off by talking a little bit more about the role of refusal, which is something that both of you touched upon. In particular, Sarah, you touched upon the usage of like the hashtag no homo as this sort of refusal of identification and legibility by algorithms. And Luis, you talked about the role of refusal in automated access work and kind of as a force of resistance against automation just reinforcing the precarious nature and devaluing of access work. So I was just wondering, could you elaborate a little bit more on the importance and functions of refusal, maybe more broadly than the examples that you provided, maybe also in terms of the impacts that it has, like within broader society, but also with regards to empowering the individuals who are doing this refusing? And either of you can start. So like, I guess like I can just ask Luis to start if that's okay.
Great question. Yes, refusal. I, as Mona had mentioned earlier on, I am a part of a working group on right, access and refusal. And we have spent the last maybe year and a half thinking about refusal and thinking about how we can opt out. And this has brought a lot of tension. In first response, it was opting out of the new classification of vulnerability that has come about since the pandemic has started, which has been prevalent in the UK, to be eligible for support in kind of like shopping, deliveries of shopping, etc. There was a response to reclassify disabled people as vulnerable so they can access these services. And this led me to think about, well, what are what mechanisms are built into the kind of situations where we can refuse not only the services that are being offered, but the labeling of vulnerability, which interestingly, the idea of vulnerability in this instance, which kind of builds on the kind of complexity of refusal, is that there is a distancing from disabled rights rhetoric too. So the reclassification of vulnerable instead of disabled is a redirecting. So I think, you know, one of the reasons, well, many reasons why I chose to talk about Wicked Problem today is really thinking about how refusal in this instance had changed in the last year, in the last few months, and like how we can refuse it constantly changing, and the reiterations, even when the Wicked Problem itself was penned like in the 1970s, which predates the kind of Reaganomic kind of neoliberal agenda that would come later on. So I know there is a tension there, and thinking about the classification of disability and how people and stakeholders can stage refusal when the stakes are constantly changing. Maybe I can add more once Sarah has added.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lisa. I think a lot of what you said really resonates. And perhaps I can just add that I think for me, refusal is always this kind of it's very ambivalent, because on the one side, I think that the provocation that I brought with me today is of course something that has like a more utopian teleology. And I'm very aware that there are situations where there is just a very very pragmatic need to be intelligible, right? And I think that there is like a complication in that refusal, because there's also I guess it's something that you cannot always do. And I guess that one of the things that I just think queer theory to me is so rich in theorizing refusal in is to always remind us that there is an ambivalence to that. And other than that, I'm happy to hear more about what Louise was going to say, because I'm really interested in what these more pragmatic or perhaps more access oriented and actually technologically grappling with things can bring as acts of refusal. Because I think, like I said, I work with aesthetics, and I think that they can only do so much, to be quite honest.
I can add another example in which we can think about, which I'm always trying to do in my work, in access work, is pointing towards the invisible labor, which is positioned against a backdrop of having to be in the background to put, God, how do I say this? The access work has a really kind of weird history, in the sense that historically, access work has always been hidden, right? To kind of center the disabled person as having agency, right? Well, how does refusal enter that framework if we're constantly toggling between the foreground and the background, what we privilege and what we kind of devalue? Like we're talking about the devaluation of care. Uber drivers, Uber Assist program in Pacific, they are underpaid, it's precarious work, but they're having to meet the growing demand of performing access work. They're providing access work in the absence of support, the absence, and there's a whole kind of discussion related to that. So I think it's not only refusal for disabled people and queer people, but it's also the community around that, surrounding that, and the infrastructure. Like more kind of, I think that's why it's interesting in thinking about multiple stakeholders and like wicked publics. How do we bring the conversation together?
Great, thank you so much. Sorry, go ahead. Oh, okay.
No, it's your turn.
Okay. Yeah, so I was going to say, great, thank you so much for your responses. They're very thorough. I actually want to change gears a little bit and ask about some ways that we can perhaps bridge the issues affected by queer people in this kind of like large-scale deployment of artificial intelligence and disabled individuals. So I know both of you actually just touched upon in your responses ways in which there's this framing of disabled people and queer people as vulnerable. And this is kind of how there is this proliferation of artificial intelligence, whether it's to help queer people seek mental health services, or whether it's to be able to allow disabled people to access some of these accommodations or anything else that they need. So are there any other ways that you can think of that there are like similar problems faced by both the queer community and disabled communities? And obviously there's so much intersection between those communities, and also just ways that we can move forward in bridging together theories and epistemologies that arise from these communities to better shape artificial intelligence. And Louise can go first.
I was going to let Sarah go first, as I went first the last time. Do you want to go first, Sarah?
I'm happy to. I'm fine either way. But yeah, well, maybe one thing that I would, I think already came across in Louise's presentation was that these communities are not necessarily separate from the get-go, right? There are intersections already, and I think in addition to these that these attributes can sort of fall into one person, I guess there's also, I think, an understanding that there is this desire to define what these people, what makes up certain aspects of their personalities from outside, right? And I think that this is why I find these speculative projects so incredibly interesting, because they kind of don't look at any sort of definitory power, but rather go from sort of experience, embodiment, and collectivity. So they actually work with what's in the room right now, and it's in this kind of this moment where one can actually experience oneself as part of a community. And I think that this has been defining for queer communities all along, and I believe, or I can imagine that the CRIP movement has similar experiences where, yeah, I guess Louise can talk to more.
You know, I was just thinking, going back to refusal, and the question just being asked is actually thinking about the tension of refusal and disclosure as a form of vulnerability. And I bring this, you know, as a, you know, if you're looking for action points, I'm almost kind of want to start a conversation again around access requests. Historically, there's always been a mechanism there that has allowed disabled people, deaf people to make an access request, which over the last few years has kind of been lost because we've been moving online, and so we've had developed, quite rightly so, the kind of universal platform where we can meet and build community in one place. But in doing that, we've lost some of the nuances of how we interact by asking the question, or do you have an access request? If you have an access request, you can email X person, which really antagonizes the idea of disclosure and what that means within a community, a queer community. It's like, who's it safe for somebody to disclose their disability, their queer identity? So I think in some ways, to think about the issues around data-driven systems and AI, is like we almost have to go back and start asking the question again. Maybe there's a way we can think about this more, but I feel like there's something there. There's something about what, going back to that kind of tension between request or disclosure and refusal and requesting. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's such an excellent point that you brought up. Like, I think there's definitely a lot of tension there that I know as being, identifying as part of both of these communities, I feel like, very often. I have one more question, if that's okay, before we jump to Q&A. And that's just to talk about the intersecting vectors of marginality and the roles they play in this. So we've talked about refusal, we've talked about disclosure, and of course, if we don't talk about things like race, then we're kind of falling into this trap of exnomination, where we're envisioning, by default, these disabled and queer people to be white, and kind of the issues that, or have high socioeconomic status and the issues that they may face. So what are the complications that arise for Black, Indigenous, Latina individuals who, in the process of refusing services or disclosing their identities? What are some of the ways that we can make this more accessible for people who face so many other barriers?
Yeah, I think to answer this question quickly, I think, a lot of the work that I do, which thinks more closely with the job dictionary of a captioner, it really is about capturing local knowledge, local knowledges on the ground, and able to recognize the cultural standings, if you like, which is definitely the case in San Diego. There is a rich history. And I think working with technologies and in these intimate ways can allow Black voices to proliferate in these spaces. And so I think is what I gestured in my presentation, is that there is this danger that we're creating this system, a two-tier system, in which we are the kind of over-prescription of captioning services, with also, I should add, the shortage of captioners too, is kind of encapsulate some of the tension of what that means for people who need the service. I know I'm really aware of this time. Sarah, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, perhaps I would just add that I think there are two things that I find quite interesting when we look at decolonial theory and decolonial philosophy, that their relationship to AI or to technology in itself is just something that is a lot more, I mean, and I think that there is in Western thought, there is this very hard partition, between nature and culture, and between the human and the non-human and so on. And I think that this is kind of, I mean, this builds a lot of our problems kind of come from this what Sylvia Wynter calls the overrepresentation of man, right? So this idea that there is a certain normative figure of the human which is kind of exceptional, and that everything must aspire to this, and that everything that does not aspire to this is something that is less, or that is, that can be extracted, and I think that this is where a lot of our troubles kind of emerge, that that the entire economic system and so on, so what is funded, what is actually built and so on, kind of caters to that system. And decolonial theory would kind of have this intervention that not only can we engage with technology as something that is, and this is where I find what also came out in the MELT example, for example, ancestral knowledge, or that is something that is something that happens between people, or something that happens between a human and a non-human, and I think in the end that would also mean that we take seriously the fact not only of an individual person's sovereignty, but also of connectedness, which kind of really unbalances our entire way of doing things, ideally. And that would also mean, I think, in the end, giving back, the means of production to those who can actually use it to create technologies in the ways that they need, and not in a way that produces value, quote unquote.
Arjun, do you want to close off this part of the event?
Yeah. So thank you so much for your wonderful responses. Again, I'm learning so much, just as I'm sure the audience is. And I think we have time for a question. Okay, so I'll hand it off to Mona to ask the first question for the Q&A.
Thank you so much to Sarah, Louise, and Arjun for running this so wonderfully, for your great contributions. I'm gonna allocate the three questions that we have, and I am mindful that we might run maybe 2 minutes over. So the first question is from Wes King, and they ask, in addition to facial recognition to identify the interiority of gayness, there are also researchers seeking to identify brain patterns associated with being gay and trans and neurodivergent. Could you discuss your thoughts on problems with this kind of research? And I'm going to allocate that to Sarah. Super briefly, your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I mean, yeah, obviously the problems are very similar, and I think that I know a little bit about how autism research is kind of developing technologies that in the end only serve to, again, assimilate emotional responses to what the normative society kind of thinks they are, right? So there's AI research that is using technologies, so children are getting virtual reality glasses to kind of respond to certain eye movements, and there's this whole gamification process where, in the end, the parents can be very happy because their child kind of responds to stars lighting up in the virtual reality glasses, and that translates to what they consider normal, emotional responses. And I think, the same would probably be the case for the brain patterns that you speak of. So yeah, I think the problems are a lot more probably than I can say in such short time. And I'll perhaps end here to have time for the rest of the questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I have another question from an anonymous participant who is asking panelists to talk a little bit more on their take on intersectionality in relation to AI. And Louise, I'm going to toss this one to you.
That's a really good question. I think there is a lot of work to be done. I think the stakes that I'm most concerned about is thinking about ethics in practice, like how we go about making this goes back to the idea of the wicked public. Like, how do we ask the right questions and how we bring the right people to the hypothetical table that we have here today and ask those intersectional questions? Like, again, it's like I repeat the example that I gave earlier about taxi drivers, that these are a kind of wicked problem that is largely intersectional. And there'll be kind of more work coming out of this. I'm trying to give this in a very short space, but yeah, there'll be more work and it's coming.
It is coming. Thank you, Louise, for that. And I'm gonna sort of close us off now. We have one more comment by Soo-Yoon Park, who is saying that what about people who are non-English speakers, people who, from the LGBTQI plus community or the disability community who don't understand English? Can we bring this kind of research throughout the world so it can affect other countries as well? So this is noted and brought into this space. And I will close us off with the last question from Jack Geiseking, who says this has been an incredible and insightful session, and thank you so much for your work. And for all three of you, I'm going to toss this to all three of you. Jack is wondering, who are you reading these days? What are you reading that really excites you on queering AI in and beyond your fields? Maybe one recommendation per panelist plus Arjun, and please also add where people can find you if they would like to reach out to you directly. And we're going to start with Arjun this time.
Yeah, the first person who comes to mind is definitely Keys. They're a fantastic researcher. So much amazing work and so much critical work at the intersections of.
Can you say the name again? So sorry.
Keys. OS Keys. Yeah. So you can find their work at ironholes.org. I can put it in the chat in a second, as well as my contact information. But yeah, just amazing work at the intersection of queerness and disability.
Thank you. And Louise?
I'm going to cheat and say you can look up a group of scholars who are running a workshop on disability justice at CHI this year, and you will find a list of scholars and who are working on disability AI and so forth.
Thank you very much, Louise. And Sarah.
Yeah, I think I already tried to bring some of the readings that I find amazing into my talk. So Nishant Shah is a wonderful theorist. You should always check out. Their work is available. A lot of it is on open access, so you could just download the book Really Fake. Then Oz Keys that Arjun mentioned. I also think Misha Cardenas is doing amazing work. And yeah, I mean, so many, but maybe this is enough for now.
Thank you very much. And I did my very best to put those into the chat. If I got those wrong, please, panelists, if you could correct those. And with that, we are 5 minutes, just 5 minutes over time. We touched upon so many important topics. I am extremely grateful to have been able to host all three of you in the Co-opting AI space. Thank you for your important thoughts on the intersection of disability, the digital, and queering AI. Much food for thought. I also sincerely want to thank Eliza, our ASL interpreter, as well as Maggie on CART today. Of course, also Team IPK, Zari, Sam, Jess, and Kayla today as well. Thank you for making this possible. And I want to point everybody to the Disability and the Digital series hosted again between Hannah Göbe, Mara Mills, Robert Stock, and Milika Shahinoor. This summer, the next event will happen on April 28th. Same time, and it will be on questioning smart urban mobility. And with that, I want to close us off, and I want to thank everybody. You will be able to find this recording on the IPK YouTube channel very soon. And with that, have a wonderful rest of your day and stay well. Thank you so much, everyone.